So, welcome to Growing with the Stars. I am Katie Ann, your resident astrologer. And this is.
I'm Kat, your resident chaos goblin. I'm pretty sure actually the Mars and the Uranus in my chart are doing some things right now. Was that our little couple there?
We can say it's that. We are also recording this right before a bunch of squares between Sagittarius and Pisces, which is making the energy a little crunchy. We're also right before the Sag new moon. There's just a lot of energy. Uh, you know, the chaos goblins are in the air. But we are back talking about Jewish history and astrology. And today's episode is exciting because we're looking to the future. We're particularly looking at like socio-political stuff based on the research that I have been doing um, to see sort of when we would see more major events. And if you have checked out our previous episodes, which you should, you would know that a lot of this is going to be cardinal sign T squares with outer planets. So, in plain people speak, that is things like uh, Neptune in Aries, Saturn in Aries, or like, things in Capricorn, major planets in Libra or Cancer. And if you've been hearing about the astrology of late, you know that we're about to have some major stuff happening in Aries. Jupiter is in Cancer. And so there's quite a few moments that are looking important over the next couple of years. So we're going to take a look at some of the dates that I'm seeing, particularly against Israel's chart, just because that is the major player, right, in the world as far as astrological charts that we have, and like who is the main character in some of these moments or how this might show up there. Obviously, I think Jews are all over the world. I am an American Jew. There are Jews lots of places, and so there is, I think, more research to be done to see like who is impacted, particularly by which transits, like which communities. Um, and that is probably for a much future date when I have had more time to do research and other astrologers have had more time to do research and check the data. I don't know if I missed anything, Kat, in my roundup.
Don't think so, but you know what I will do is if any other Jewish astrologers do want to collaborate with you, I will throw a email up here, right about there, maybe. And we will go ahead and have you shoot us an email so that you guys can get in touch and you can see if you want to plan maybe, around any more of this for future episodes. Just throwing it out there. Very exciting, but I'm ready to get into it today if you are.
All right, let's start. So, the first thing that I'm seeing is we're looking at the Leo solar eclipse in 2026. So, before we look at the mess that is this against Israel's chart, we're just going to look at the eclipse first. Right? And so this one seems in some ways a little bit more kind of like a minor T square that you would say. And so we've got the main things to look at. Let me clear some of this up. I want you to be focusing on the fact that we've got a pretty tight Neptune Venus opposition, and they're both, within 4 or 5 degrees, but they are squaring Mars in Cancer. And so there is, I think, an early T square here. And I think the other reason this is important for Israel that we'll talk about is the fact that we have this giant Leo stellium. So already we're seeing some of the layups for, I think, some initial tension. Um, and I want you to just kind of take a look at it when we do the bi-wheel. So this is the bi-wheel. On the inside now is Israel's founding chart, and on the outside is the eclipse. And I think what's really striking that we're seeing is things like Mercury conjunct the natal moon. We're seeing this eclipse happening very close to the natal Saturn in the chart. And so all of these things are sort of pinging for me. And so we're seeing something significant. It's maybe not as intense of a T square as I would like to see, but it certainly is there. And so some of the things that I'm just sort of noticing in this is that we're dealing with Saturn in Aries in the seventh house. And this could be a really major quote moment around alliances, as well as more issues regarding popular support. So these are things particularly hitting the 11th house, where you see a lot about supporters, alliances really coming up there over and over again. And eclipses are often considered major beginnings, major endings. And so there's some sort of major beginning occurring there because this is a solar eclipse. So the sun and the moon are together in Leo. I don't know that this is as pivotal as what we're going to be seeing next, though, which is the Cancer Capricorn eclipses. So, if you know anything about astrology, you know that um, the nodes move backwards. So, they are going to go from Leo and Aquarius into Cancer Capricorn. And this is really important for, once again, we're seeing eclipses in cardinal signs. Already was like ding, 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 ding. And particularly for Israel's chart, this is the 10th and the fourth house. So this is the place of like both your foundations, your history, your lineage, as well as sort of your leaders, your public life, your visibility and legacy. So this is looking important. Overall, these are having a lot of questions around calling into questions the leadership and the foundation of the state. I think that we're going to potentially be seeing a rise of a few other things, but let's just start taking a look at the first one in the cycle. So this is 2027. Sometimes the weirdest thing about astrology is how deep into the future you go. So this is July 18th, 2027, and I have placed this for Tel Aviv. I know that Israel considers its capital now Jerusalem. I use Tel Aviv because Israel was founded in Tel Aviv. And so it's just, I don't think it makes a major difference as far as the ascendant of the chart, but I do think just from a like how this is going to impact that state, that's the best place I like to look at, which is the original location. It's just the techniques that I use in my practice. So I want to be consistent. So we are once again in T square land. By now, we are really dealing with Mars in Libra, in a loose square to Neptune in Aries. So that's Mars, there is Neptune, and they're both squaring Mercury in Cancer, right? So there's this question of sort of the nation, violence, activity. We saw October 7th really hit when Mars ingressed into Libra. I believe that was October 27th, October 7th, 2023. Me and dates are not always the best. So you have this tension between Israel, kind of that is the ascendant for Israel, and the other, which is Aries. And then they're having some tension with Mercury, right? Communication, information, travel. And so this might be easier to explain when we look at it within the biwheel. So, right, we see even more intense things popping off. We have, right, Mars opposing Neptune. We also have approximating the Neptune opposition is getting really close in this chart. It's still about 4 or 5 degrees off, but we're starting to see tension of the idealism of the state and how others, allies, partners see the state. I think that there's probably an intense potential for disillusionment because we've also been having the Saturn Neptune co-presence there for a while. And that T square is also amplified when we bring in the natal Venus to the chart. So Venus is at 4 degrees of Cancer. And so we're seeing a lot of tension in the resolution is between this idea of how the state does violence or aggression or what they consider as defense, how its allies see that, the disillusionment or the reimagining of its allies or partners and others. And then we're seeing sort of how is the leadership taking this on? How are they trying to harmonize it with Venus? How are they trying to communicate it with Mercury? All of these things are pretty intense. And the other thing to really notice is that this eclipse, right, it's a partial eclipse. It's kind of far from the nodes, but it's still like what is still considered an eclipse in astrology. And we're having it exactly on the midheaven and the IC, right? We're having the exact degrees of authority and its foundations are being called into question. And so this looks like a particularly important turning point that we might be facing.
I'm curious because you said there are is like the Neptune influence. And then right now, I know it's more the modern association, but right now, 2025, right? I think Saturn's in Pisces. Is that correct?
Yeah, so
And
Saturn has dipped into Aries a little bit earlier in the summer of 2025, but will fully ingress early February. I think February 14th, actually, 2026.
okay, because I was curious because I was talking about that with some people and they were talking about how that is like about like foundations and like the stability of your foundations or something like
Mm,
that. And I don't know if that's similar in or like the vibe was not, I'm not I don't know
yeah.
100%, but I'm curious to how that re might relate since you
So,
mentioned the
so
10th and the 4th as well.
yeah, so let me pull up that chart one more time. So I think particularly it matters for Israel, particularly because of what area Saturn rules for Israel. Um, right. So when we're dealing with in the Israeli chart, this is, let me find, I can't see things. Let's just look at the Israel chart. It's a little bit clearer to see this. Dear God. So if we look at the Israel chart, there's two things I want you to really be thinking about when it comes to Saturn. We look at both where is Saturn going to be in a transit and what houses Saturn rules. In this case, for Israel, I'm not saying for everybody, but Saturn happens to rule the foundations, right? The fourth house of home, family, lineage, the past, as well as the fifth house of pleasure, entertainment. We see hobbies here, we see children come up here. And so you have this very interesting kind of duality that those two things are really held by Saturn. And then we're seeing Saturn, the transit, going through the seventh house of Aries, which is sometimes alliances, the other who show up there. Alliances can sort of be, I think, 11th or 7th. I think sometimes 7th is like neighbors, enemies can sometimes show up there. Mundane astrology is a little tricky, or world astrology. And so I think what we see here is these topics are going to be brought up during the Saturn Neptune conjunction. Saturn Neptune typically is dissolving, which is Neptune, structures, systems, grounding, which is Saturn, right? When these two come together, things fall apart. The last time we had a Saturn Neptune conjunction was in 1989. It was with Uranus, so there is a suddenness aspect. But the best example I have for folks is the Berlin Wall fell. We had a sudden Uranus collapse, dissolving, Neptune, structure, wall, Saturn. So it's not going to be the exact same because Uranus isn't in the picture. And it's also in a very different sign, but we would be seeing things dissolving or falling apart or crumbling. And so there is, I think, a disillusionment that often happens when Saturn and Neptune are together. We've sort of been in the middle of that because Saturn and Neptune have been co present in Pisces the entire time Saturn's been in Pisces. It intensifies or hits its apex February of 2026 when they have the exact conjunction, also around the time of an Aquarius eclipse, but that might be for a different episode. But what I am seeing is the potential for Israel to be seeing some disillusionment and dissolving and cracks, particularly around its alliances, and how it's the foundations of the state are being brought in, and sort of Saturn is up in the 11th of popular support. And so I think within this context, we might be seeing an even more rapid decline of popular support as well as political support for Israel over this period. And so when we get back to something like this eclipse, right? This is July 18th, 2027. We're way past the Saturn Neptune conjunction. They're super far apart. Saturn's almost at the tail end of Aries. But the ongoing pressure that has been occurring is amplified here for a couple of reasons. One, this is a lunar eclipse, right? This is the moon in Capricorn. And so the moon is looking to Saturn for support, and it's not a great Saturn. This is Saturn in Aries. And so the ongoing, this is, I think, that the outside, one way to read this is the outside questions around alliances support is creating a foundational review and struggle of the basics, the foundations of the state itself. And one way we're seeing this tension show up, right, is in the T square around sort of the self and military and violence, the illusions, disillusionments of the other, and then finally, like, how do we communicate and resolve this from a leadership perspective? So, whoever is in power, whoever is especially the prime minister of Israel at this time, looks incredibly important.
Um, that's really interesting. And it harkens back. So I took a class in college, basically the founding of like it's history of the Middle East through like the medieval period and or from the no, excuse me. I took a class in college and it was the history of the Middle East and included the founding of Israel and talked about like how, you know, basically the British came in and did what they did. And then, it went back and there were, weapons that fell off trucks, things like that. That, and I can always pull that book. If you ever want to, if anybody ever wants to hear from it, I can always get the information. But it's just interesting to think about what that might entail, right? Because when you think about the foundation and the way Israel was founded and the reasons and like all the complicated, very complex things like behind, you know, that it's like it will be interesting to see. I'll be interested to hear more
Yeah.
about what you think is coming kind of back, given that, alliances in the past for Israel have been, obviously very important in getting certain things done.
Yeah, I am smiling mostly because of your cat, but absolutely. And I think one other thing to be watching that's very interesting in this that I hadn't mentioned, we'll talk more about Pluto because this is also Israel's going through its Pluto opposition. Um, so it has Pluto in Leo at 12. At this point, it's not within, I would say, a really worthwhile orb by 2027, but Pluto's at 6 degrees. What's much more interesting is that the South Node is going to be exactly it is within arc seconds. It's arc seconds off the natal Pluto. And so there is, I think, this real question around the shadow and power and the hidden dynamics that is really supportive to this state. And there is something about release and letting go that is certainly being very amplified here in a pretty intense way. And so I am very curious to be watching this eclipse just to see what does it look like when the South Node is release and letting go here. And how does that then impact the overall structures that we're seeing as far as what makes Israel function today, which is quite a bit of international support. Whether you like that or don't like that, that is a lot of the reality of it.
I do believe a lot of citizens hold dual citizenship, if I'm not mistaken, if that's correct.
Some people do. I mean, some people do. I wouldn't say everybody, but it's quite common, I think, for many folks that I do know. Um, who have either like made what's called aliyah or like immigrated there. But there is also just a lot of just like political support, whether it's funding from the United States, funding from the EU. Um, there is invested interest in in Israel staking the claim that it has. The one other thing I will say about this chart that is really striking to me, and I'm trying to get my notes into like a separate doc so that not everybody has to see everything that I'm talking about, is this grand fire trine. So when I say that, what I'm looking at is we see a we see Saturn in Aries, which we've talked about, is in a tight trine to both Jupiter and Leo, conjunct the natal Mars in Leo, and they're all trining Jupiter in Sagittarius. So there's some natal and transit stuff coming up. This could look like a moment of like popular violence and uprising. I think it's a possibility. It is a trine, so it's not necessarily as activating. But I would say that because it's also the third house, the place of short distance travel, that there could be things around what we have seen historically in Israel was like violence around cars, the bus system, trains, roadways. And so that's just something that I'm also watching as well. I'm not saying that it is definite, but is something to kind of keep in mind.
And of course, keeping in mind too, like historically in warfare as well, just to temper a little bit, you go after transportation lines. So it wouldn't be unsurprising if you were to see like people going after transportation. So the astrology is supportive of, I mean, that as well, that historical precedent. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to talk about another eclipse in the Capricorn Cancer cycle. And this one we're going to talk about is January 2028, particularly January 12th, 2028. So this is another lunar eclipse. This is the time where the moon is in Cancer, the sun is in Capricorn, and it's a really intense T square with Saturn. It's pretty sharp. It's
it's right
pretty
there.
sharp. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to miss. And so I think my gut instinct is that this is probably where with the previous eclipses, we're seeing things starting to kind of brew and get like maybe more front and center. This is where I think the crisis is going to potentially intensify, right? And so we're once again seeing some questions, I think, about a couple of things. First off, there is the ongoing crisis, I think, regarding leadership, right? So we're once again seeing the 10th and 4th house of the chart pinging wildly. It's not as tight to the midheaven and the IC as last time of the Israel chart. We've got the moon at 21 degrees, right? And not 25, but it's still there. We're also seeing the south node pretty close to the natal moon. So Israel has the moon at 4 Leo. The south node has passed over it into 2 Leo. So there's quite a few things sort of ongoing in this chart. It's also an interesting echo of the 2026 eclipse that we talked about at the beginning, where everything was happening in Leo, and now everything is happening in Aquarius. So we're seeing a sort of foil in some ways to the other. So, like, what the fuck? What the fuck does that mean, right? Um, um, we're seeing the ongoing crisis around what is leadership. I think we're also going to be seeing, I think, some questions around fifth house topics. There might be some questions around birth rate and children and like stress around population. The other way that this might be showing up is there might be stressors. I think the BDS movement might be really picking up here, and a lot of the like entertainment economic sector might be feeling some of the stress from a BDS boycott. Um, and the final version is that the moon, right, often represents women in the world. And so I think that there might be a real question around like women more generally in Israel as we're seeing this ongoing moment of Uranus and Gemini in the ninth house, where we often see philosophy, but also religious belief. And so I'm wondering a lot about sort of the rise of the religious right. Are we seeing more intense pressure on women and how women can or should show up in public spaces? Are we seeing more pressure for more of a trad wife moment within Israel to boost the Jewish population? There is a big fear traditionally where because of the occupation, you can actually, if you bring in the populations of the West Bank and Gaza before October 7th, there was a significant population of a kind of a majority minority of a minority being a minority sort of ruling over a majority of Palestinians. And so I think that there might be some real intense questions around those issues. So that's a little bit varied, but those are some of the ways this might be intensifying, where we might be seeing an ongoing push towards a more hardcore, fundamentalist Jewish version that has an impact, particularly on women.
It's just interesting how that is reflective of kind of like what we're saying in here. And so I'm just wondering if that's an overarching theme. Do you think like globally? I mean, with a very, I mean, caveat that you can't really, know for whatever, but like, with that placement, is that something that maybe like in relation to like maybe the alliances might come up? Because I know England is also kind of moving towards back um more of that traditional, not traditional, but
There's like a rise
conservative.
of conservatism.
That's what I'm
How
trying to say, yeah.
I don't know that I could speak about it on a more like world level
Hmm.
because I haven't really looked into it specifically. I do think that there has been like I mean, we have just had like I'd have to look at sort of as like I'd want to look at like sort of when tradwives were coming up. My guess is that some of the roots of this were more Pluto and Capricorn and sort of the shadows of tradition, the shadows of and Capricorn isn't like always a conservative sign with a capital C, but Capricorn is often looking backwards to the past. And I think towards the end of sort of the boss babe, um, kind of feminine, like capitalism co-opting of feminism, we had this rejection as capitalism isn't serving people, that they saw tradwives or like traditional roles as an alternative, as an escape, which it both is and isn't, right? You're instead of being reliant on a company, on an organization, you're reliant on a man, which has its own issues. Uh, and so I think part of it is sort of looking at more of some of that data to kind of go back on it. And different places, right? Different countries have different charts and different things that they're sensitive to. And so one of the issues that we're seeing when I've been trying to do prediction, particularly around Israel, is that like this is the first Uranus return Israel has had. So I don't have historical data around the last time Uranus was in Gemini, how it really impacted them, like as a state, right? Because they were born with this placement. And so with the United States and some of the other places like Russia, we have way more data to work with to like make bigger, easier predictions to kind of stand 10 toes down on. I talk about, and so I'm trying to sort of weave multiple things together to kind of bring in what I think is happening. But I'm very much going to be watching Uranus and Gemini for Israel because it is the ninth house. There is changes, I think, around religion, philosophy, and that is just so important to sort of the state's sense of identity that that's where I'm like looking to some of this as well. Did that answer your question?
That actually did answer my question. Yes, thank you. It's fascinating.
Um, Let me pull in the next chart I want to look at, which is December 31st, 2028. It always feels weird when I talk about the future. I'm like, God damn, that is far away. It
It,
feels far
it
away to me. My
yeah, it
brain,
feels
like,
far, but it's still close. It'll be
I
2028
know.
so fast. It's like, wasn't it just 2020? 2 weeks to lower the curve,
Yeah.
right? That's where we're at.
Oh God. Take me back.
Yeah.
Take me back. So this fun chart, once again, we have eclipses. Neptune is still in Aries. We have Neptune for a very long time in Aries, guys. Um, and we have this really intense, this is a cardinal grand cross. So we've got, right, Neptune at the top in Aries. We've got Mars at the bottom in Libra. We've got the sun and the moon very tight, the nodes. This is, I would consider, I don't know if this is technically a total eclipse or not, but it's pretty fucking close to one. It's a it's a pretty loud eclipse. Now let's look at it against the Israel chart. Right. Once again, we're seeing a lot of squares, additional squares are coming up, right? Because we also have Venus now, and we're having her kind of getting involved in the Grand Cross as well. You can technically say the lot of fortune is sort of being brought in with these tight aspects. It's messy. And we also have one of the most challenging things you can have by transit or in a chart in general, which is Saturn, a malefic, in a difficult house, the eighth, beginning to overcome the moon in the 11th. This traditionally is just seen as really, really shitty to experience. And as somebody that has gone through this personally with Saturn and Pisces overcoming at one point my sun and then both my Venus and Jupiter, it's a rough experience. So this is another moment I think of intensification. Is it going to be as pivotal as the last one? And I think what I'm seeing with this one is what is the dream of the state, right? This thing that came up earlier as Neptune has been involved. This one does remind me a little bit of October 7th, where we see it potentials for attacks coming up with violence and irritation. And the eighth house is also making me wonder, the Saturn overcoming the moon is making me wonder about financial deals potentially, right? The eighth house is often asked like things that we owe others and things that are owed to the partners or the alliances could potentially be coming up and sort of people calling in checks that Israel is maybe not ready to cash or doesn't actually have the money to cash. And so I think that is quite important. The final thing to kind of show is the grand air trine. So let's take a look at that real quick. Where there is a really interesting moment where we have Uranus nearly conjunct well, Uranus nearly conjunct Mercury in a very tight trine to Neptune, as well as it's a little bit loose, but Pluto is sort of finishing that out at 7 degrees. So 7, 10, 11 degrees of the signs are all coming together. I think that this is a lot around potentially communication of an idea of the state. We might be seeing a sort of new sense around the nation, religion, and a reimagining of the future and how children potentially play into this, and sort of how do we reformat that? How do we present that? How do we do that? And so that might be something that is more behind the scenes, sort of coming out later. Trines are a little more subtle than the squares and the crosses. And so we might be seeing that like this moment kind of catalyzes a new idea around what this nation really is.
Do you feel like there's any hints in the astrology what that might lean if we're doing predictive?
The new sense of of like what we're talking about.
Yeah, like is there anything that gives you a sense of like where that might lead, like what the vibe might be in that new sense of national identity or
I
identity?
mean, I think at its worst, what we could see is really doubling down on like a hard religious state, right? Just completely abandoning sort of the idea of democracy and kind of leaning into sort of hard kind of theocratic or kind of a version of that. Particularly with Neptune and Pluto being involved, there is some sort of like dream and power and dream and sort of the shadows really coming up in a particular way that feels either both it's very potent, but it can be very ominous. I think what I need to see is I want to be watching some of these earlier transits because this is not the last time. Basically, Uranus is going over this Mercury a couple of times. And so by this point, we should be seeing, I think, the articulation of what's coming up in the sense of we probably will be seeing hints of it earlier in some of the earlier points in time that I was talking about because Uranus has been kind of hovering over this Mercury for quite a bit. So it could look like a couple of different things. I mean, I think another version is really a reimagining of is it I think the difficulty is like you have a conundrum of a Jewish democracy with also a very large non-Jewish population. And so like how do you handle the more idealistic version in my mind is like is there a version that like allows there to still be like Jewish protections as well as like Palestinian and Arab protections? And that could be, I think, a more positive version where we would then see sort of this major choice by leadership that is still challenging the original Neptune, right? We still have this hard square. That seems a little honestly far-fetched than the one I'm the other way, based on what I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, that is interesting, a little stressful. Feels a little
Yeah,
intense.
this astrology is not easy. I don't pretend I don't pretend that I look at this stuff and feel quite nervous. I would not be surprised if we see major geopolitical tension kind of being embodied in in these charts and sort of leading towards some intense political geopolitical chaos in the early 2030s. Um,
Oh,
but
in
the
the
next chart,
30s.
yeah, I know we're not even to the 30s yet. We're going to talk a little bit about I want to actually talk about the Jupiter Neptune opposition. This is not an eclipse, I promise. We don't have an eclipse this time. But I think this one is particularly significant because we have two of the slower planets once again in play. Um, and we also, literally, I was just looking at the Jupiter Neptune stuff, and then it was like, oh, by the way, the moon's like, what's up, bitches? You want to come hang and do a T square? And I'm like, why does everything have to come back to this?
Honestly, I'm surprised at how loud the T-squares are because now I'm seeing them every time you pull them up. I mean, on these ones, they're just
Yeah.
ba-bam. They're like, phew. That's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. It becomes also a grand cross when I pull in Israel's Venus. We actually get a grand cross.
And a brief reminder for the Grand Cross for the audience
So a T
members.
square is a triangle,
Right.
and a grand cross is going to be a four-way. And so this grand cross will annotate so you can see it because it is hard to see. We have Venus at the top, we have Jupiter, we've got the moon, and we have Neptune. And so this the difference a T square there's a lot of energy kind of moving in one direction and things are funneling out. There's a sort of apex point of relief. A grand cross is more like you're pinned and being pulled in four different directions. It's kind of like I wouldn't really call it quartering, but it is sort of the tense pain of being stretched in different directions. And nobody really is a release point. It doesn't have the same catharsis as uh, as a Grand Cross. Um, and so, I think that there are a couple of things to look at where there is, I think, intense pressure, partially from alliances. And one thing to sort of look at in that I'm noticing is that Mars is just hammering the natal Pluto. So there is this idea of aggression and power coming up. Mars, Pluto are not chill. They've never been chill together. Um, and can have an intensity around violence, unfortunately. Um, I don't like seeing them together, particularly like this. And I think there's also some intense questions around resourcing because as Mars and Pluto are over here having to battle shit out, we still have Saturn in Taurus, and there is an intense question around resourcing and alliances, and that this is an ongoing story, I think, around who's on what and where are we getting shit from, and like balancing the checkbook. I mean, it keeps going, unfortunately. But I think what we're seeing is a lot of like, we have some questions around the resources. I think the alliances are really strained. Um, and I think one of the things that I'm really looking at is like this moon in Capricorn, where there is a tension, I think, of like, where do we, how do we get out of this? Right? Do we look to the past? Is that the best example for us to get there? And when I see the moon in Capricorn, the moon in Capricorn is in exile. It's literally it's in the sign opposing its home sign, right? Cancer is the home sign of the moon, and Capricorn is its away sign. And so it's kind of in exile and it has to look at things from a very different perspective. And it's also fucking broke. It doesn't do well in Capricorn. It has some mitigation in this chart because it can see Saturn, transit Saturn at least over in Taurus, which is a whole other story that we can get into. But I think that there's some real questions around how do we move forward and what do we hold on to. If there
That's
is, I
interesting.
think, an intensification of a boycott and the boycotts really take off, there is, I think, also the possibility that folks are just really hurting on the ground. Like this could be just really damaging potentially to the Israeli economy. I mean, there's always potential different choices. I mean, astrology tells you the themes that are going to come up, and different astrologers are going to argue different things. I believe in free will and choices. And so I think a lot of these decisions depend on who Israel votes into power, and having to reimagine leadership. And how that is reimagined, I think, defines a lot of these questions and it defines a lot of how Israel does or doesn't move forward. I think it's interesting seeing the tension of Jupiter, this very like gregarious, affable planet, which they have a very strong Jupiter in Sagittarius. That there, I think there is the potential, if they're willing to like handle the fact that like the narrative and the image that Israel has of itself, the illusion and dream, it needs to be reviewed. And if they can't handle that review, that's where things really crumble. And so I think that's really the ultimate question, which is like, are you able to understand and hold that like the narrative you have of yourself is not what others see of you and perceive of you anymore? And if you can't handle that and you're still trying to force the old narrative, then yes, things will fail. Or you're going to become more erratic, more extreme, and potentially more isolated. But it's a really important, I mean, it's a really big ask for Israel to do that of itself because it's so foundational for like it's foundational for everything. And I think that's what we're seeing and that's part of the crisis is that it would take quite a while to reimagine and rewrite that.
I mean, I would imagine that's a big ask to ask of an individual, let alone a nation, you know. But that is interesting that you say that. It does feel like this kind of does round out what feels like is going on. It's starting to round out what's going on right now, where we had started talking about at the beginning with Saturn kind of in this, first going even back to moving into Pisces and then going into this first eclipse. It does feel like it's starting like as you're talking, going through these like I'm following like a line of like progress, even just from how you're explaining things of like the potential of things to happen. Like, of course, like again, we're not
Yeah.
saying we're so smart, we can tell you what you're gonna eat for dinner tomorrow, right? Like, but um it's you know, it's interesting. Do you think this 2028 one is there then another chart that comes after and then continues, or does it like round off certain experiences that might be coming?
I mean, the hard truth is that I think this goes into the 2030s. I want to talk about two more charts today, particularly um, December 12th, 2030. And what was the last one that I have? And I have another one that's for 2032. And that's when we actually get to the Pluto opposition. And I think that's really sort of when this all really kind of hits its max point.
Okay, so
Um,
that's
so if
wow.
Yeah. Basically, what we've all been, these are the things that we've been seeing are often like lead up points. I think these are critical moments, they are defining moments and sort of setting the stage. There are crises and there are actions that are done that are kind of building and building and building. Um, but let's talk about why these two are a big deal.
So,
I'm actually playing with it a little bit. So let's talk about, to cut back into it, I want to talk about December 12th, 2030, very early in the day, um, for a couple of reasons. We have this is just after an eclipse, right? So about a day or two prior to this, the moon was in Gemini, and another lunar eclipse. Okay, and we now have a T square hitting, right? We've got Mars again in Libra, Neptune in Aries, and the moon in Cancer. So we have this T square. So once again, we're seeing some of the major things where a critical moments, an eclipse, where there's a major ending has just occurred or is signaled. We see a cardinal T square. Um, but we also see things coming into major focus, particularly with Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune. So let's talk about the big boys. Um,
oh, I see that
and
Pluto was at 13 degrees over there on that last
yeah, so
chart.
Pluto here, yeah, is at 12, and now Pluto is at 10. So we're getting within 2 degrees. It's getting tight. Uranus is separating, but is still 4 degrees away from the natal Uranus in Gemini. That is a lot. And we have also got, I'm actually shocked because I didn't realize this until just now, almost an exact opposition to the natal Neptune. We're 2 arc seconds off. I want you to think of like a sliver of a sliver. So we've got major outer planet alignments happening, returns and oppositions, and we've got an eclipse, and we have a T square. If this is not a crisis moment, I don't know what is. I don't know what is. This is so loud. It's like screaming. We've also got Mercury conjunct, like nearly conjunct the natal Jupiter. I mean, it's a very loud chart. And we also have Mars separating from the natal Neptune. It's just, this is the kind of thing that I look at where I'm like, oh shit, that's a lot. What is going on? Um, and so there's a couple of things, which is, right, it's again, what is the public presentation of this state? How do they present themselves? What are they? What is the dream of this state? And a lot of the natal questions around Jewish democracy, the Palestinian question, I think are really being challenged here. Um, and there's a real question around support. Like once again, these sorts of the questions that have been coming up over and over again is sort of the ideas of the state, its religious identity, its alliances, how it's seen in the world are all intensified into a hard like shell of a moment. And I cannot tell you how much whoever is leading Israel in 2030, like if it's Netanyahu, like I don't know what to say, y'all. That's just fucked. But there is also like as all of this is getting exact, we're seeing even the angles are getting to be almost exactly on top of each other, which is insane, right? The ascendant is a couple degrees off the ascendant. The descendant, I mean, just there is this sort of pivotal return to this like who are we and what are we doing? Um, And right, a lot of it is the release point in the T square, right? So when I talk about a cardinal T square, it's a triangle, right? The apex of that triangle is the moon. And so once again, it's there's a sense both of like women, um, gender issues, who is leading Israel at this point, um, as well as like how the people might be showing up as well. Sometimes the moon is sort of the people of the state. And so there is a real kind of question of the masses, and how they are aligned or not aligned with how they want things to move forward. It's a very interesting chart, to be looking at. And I think one that I particularly want to do more study of because I think it's getting these things exact, like when the exact T square happens, getting the exact, are these the exact angles? looking at it a layer deeper for additional timing techniques, which I would use things like perfections, potentially zodiacal releasing, because we do have a good time chart for Israel. All of these factors are going to lend an additional level of insight to how this is going to show up, how this is going to really happen. Um,
So looking at
Go
it,
ahead.
it looks like they have a legislative election on October 27th of 2026. Um, and that will be kind of, I wonder how that would relate to this chart, if there's anything in the future that we might
Um,
look at in um like relation, if that's a significant date at
yeah.
all.
I mean, I think the thing that's interesting, I mean, it's a parliamentary system, and so they might be holding snap elections.
Hmm.
And so it's a little bit different than the United States where it's not as fixed.
Hmm.
Um, but this does look like an incredibly pivotal moment and sort of deciding who are we and who do we want to be. The final one is, oh my God, 2032. We are going to 20 fucking 32, October 18th. Um, there is It's a very interesting chart. Partially because I did look at perfections for this one, and the eclipses are in the profected sign, which is basically saying that things are amplified. Actually, let me triple check this. I'm just triple checking my math. Sometimes I mess up, and I don't want to say things that aren't true.
It's a good habit to have.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So yeah, the eclipses will be in. So Libra is the perfected sign. And so, yes, we are having Libra being affected. It is an Aries eclipse, but Libra is also affected because it is another lunar eclipse, right? And so, this is a T square with Jupiter at the
I was just
base.
about to ask. I was like, it's really light, but I think I see that T-square.
Yeah, I mean, it's within, 3 or 4 degrees. And you've had this ongoing, it's loose, but you also have the ongoing kind of square loosely with, excuse me, Neptune. That has also been sort of pinging over some of this year. So just to remind folks, Jupiter is kind of I wouldn't really call it an outer. He's definitely one of the traditional planets, but he does move more slowly, right? He's not quite like Saturn, which it takes like 2 to 3 years, but he moves in a sign for once every year. And so he's definitely been pinging and irritating Neptune. And so some of this energy is sort of being crystallized in the eclipse. And, the perfected sign is Libra. So the sort of sense of self, the identity of the country is being activated pretty intensely. Whenever I'm talking with one-on-one with clients, I will if you're in a year, let's just say you're in a Libra year and eclipses are happening in Libra, I'll be like, you might not usually be sensitive to eclipses, but you are going to be this year because the sign is activated, right? Or if you're in a Leo or Cancer year where the sun or moon is particularly active, you're going to be more sensitive to eclipses. And so Israel is sensitive in this time frame specifically to transits through Libra and is especially going to be sensitive to this eclipse. And so the interesting thing is that we're seeing the sun with the south node, I believe, or the north node, excuse me. Um, and the sun does not do well in Libra, right? The sun is considered in fall here. Part of that reasoning, I believe, is right. The fall equinox is when the sun enters Libra. And so we actually see the light diminish throughout Libra season. And so the sun likes to shine. And so the sun's not going to do well here. And so I think that there is both a hunger and an appetite for leadership with the North Node and it's being so close. But there might also still be another leadership crisis, um, particularly having that there's something that is sort of disrupting the sun. It is being eclipse, so it can't shine. And so that can have a corrosive, potentially, or corruption of power. The next thing I am looking at as well is Saturn, which Saturn has just entered. Is Saturn is in Cancer. It has already, I don't know if it's had a conjunction with Uranus at this point, but it is pretty closely co-present with Uranus and Cancer, right? This is also the place of leadership, right? Because this is the 10th house in Israel's chart, right? If we bring that in again, you'll see that up at the top. So we're seeing the potential for sudden shakeups and like, right? We talked about structures having shaken up, power and stability being shaken up. There is something that's sort of questioning that. And it brings in the sort of foundations of the state. It could be bringing in the foundations of its foundational documents, might be a thing that comes up, right? It's the things that it sort of is built on could be at play here. We might also see a surprising collapse of a government is also very possible.
It's interesting because you talked about Jupiter being like a transitional, and it's when I think about it, you think about those outer planets as maybe support from allies in a way, and then the Jupiter transition to a more inner, I don't know. This is where my brain's going. I don't know if that makes sense. Like a more like internally, less externally supported situation where like they're making decisions for themselves internally potentially.
Well, you have a lot of planets in places of struggle, is what I'll say. Jupiter
Right.
does not like being in Capricorn. It's in fall here. It sort of is trying to make do with a shitty situation. And he is looking to a pretty weak Saturn for support. Um, all around, when I look at this from a like dignity, like who has resources in this chart? Okay. So Jupiter doesn't have a ton of resources. Saturn's kind of broke. The moon is disrupted, so the moon isn't super energetic. The moon's looking to Mars. He's okay. He can't really see Aries, so that's kind of a struggle. And he is getting there's at least mutual reception between Mars and Mercury, but they're not the main players in this chart, right? The main players are all struggling, and so they're going to have more of a tendency towards their excessive versions of themselves, right? We're going to see Saturn can get either hyper protective in Cancer. Cancer does have a tendency towards like xenophobia. High amounts of patriotism can come up here. The United States does have that Cancer stellium. uh, we are almost aggressively patriotic in the most annoying ways. Um, right. And so Jupiter, he's trying to be affable and say yes to things. He doesn't have a whole lot that he can do here to sort of be a release point. The sun, right, is maybe trying to do the balancing act and trying to kind of harmonize all these things, but needs to take decisive action and isn't really able to do that. Um, right. There's a lot of just very destabilized energy in this that's really hard to work with. This is not a chart I would say you should intentionally start things or try to get shit done with on a personal level.
Yeah, it does not look like a fun one. Do
Yeah.
you coming from your perspective look at planets as like perhaps in this instance as representative of interactions with like outer and inner like entities? Like for example, if the US was like represented on this chart by like a like would a particular planet be representative of potentially like an alliance between the US and Israel on this chart, or like England and the you know, for
Yeah.
example, historically speaking, like does that play into like how you look at what you're thinking about futuristically?
It brings in a level of research that I would like to do and haven't done yet, and how sort of, different planets might be embodied by different countries. Um, we do see a pretty intense, I mean, once again, we're getting to the exact Pluto opposition here. It's not exact. It's applying. It's already happened once and they're about to have their second very soon. So there's about 20. 20 arc seconds off, give or take. But that's a very in tight Pluto opposition. So there is certainly, I think, a question around alliances that are definitely coming up here. Um, just like who exactly is who is a level I don't feel great at applying to this. Um, and I think ultimately there's also the final aspect of this chart to mention is actually Chiron. So as this is all happening, Chiron is also transiting the natal sun of Israel. Um, and I bring that up just to say, like, there's a lot, I think, around wounds, leadership, rejection that might be coming up here that I think particularly also makes me nervous because it might create an emotional. Sometimes Chiron can be incredibly healing, but if you aren't working your shit, Chiron can make you incredibly rigid or incredibly victim minded in the sense that like you're the one that's always like you create a real martyr complex about yourself. Um, and so there could be a lot around. And at the same time, actually, let me see if I can find it again. I think Mercury is transiting the natal Chiron. So there's multiple Chiron aspects. So we have the Sun Chiron conjunction. We have Mercury almost exact the natal Chiron. So Mercury will put a microphone to Chiron. It will certainly allow it to be spoken, to be heard. Um, and the sun and Chiron conjunct the sun will maybe like hide Chiron, right? It gets overwhelmed by the sun and its brightness. There's sort of an infusion and renewal around it potentially. And so I think that there's both a potential for catharsis or the potential for reimagining itself as victim, as wounded, as rejected. And this could be both around leadership, around the finances of the state, because the second house is also like the money that we have. Um, Mercury sometimes also represents children. And so there might be some wounds around like everything going on and how it impacts the future and people's opportunities. So all of these things could be coming up here. Uh, and this chart, I think, just feels it feels very reactive and not reacting from a necessarily healthy place. And I think that's partially why I'm like, this
This is
this
where your
doesn't have
concerns are coming in.
it doesn't have the same violence that I have seen in some of the other charts, particularly with Mars and Virgo in the 12th. It might be a moment that is actually quite on the surface, but is a time when like things are decided in back rooms that ultimately could be undermining the state itself, right? It
Well,
sort of is like making an agreement or deciding that you're going to attack somebody, but planning for a future date.
yeah, I'm looking at it and it's what is it? It's Taurus, eighth house, right? And the sun is like obscuring Chiron. And that's what
Yeah.
is that north node or south node?
That is the North Node as
That is
well
north
in
node.
Taurus.
Okay.
Um,
So I'm just thinking about the little that I do know, right? If you're saying, especially what you just said, like Chiron being obscured by the sun, which is like the performative aspect, right? And then the eighth house is that considered? No, that's not a dark house, right? Like what quote unquote
it's not considered a cadent house. It's considered a difficult house because
difficult.
it's a blind spot to the ascendant. The second and eighth houses are both named traditionally the gates of Hades. And so we sometimes do seek topics around death show up, particularly in the eighth, more so than in the second, but also a lot around like assets, debts, things you owe other people. And some of the wound might be this feeling of constantly being indebted to their alliances and being resentful of the alliances. And that could certainly be a piece of like what is sort of coming up in the Pluto opposition on top of it, of sort of being like, we, as much as you think we owe you, you also owe us things, right? Like this isn't just a one-way street and like it's not us coming begging at your door. Might be another way that this really manifests. And instead trying to reframe that narrative of saying like, we aren't going to capitulate to our alliances. Our alliances need to beg and ask us for things.
Does it give like end of World War One Treaty of Versailles vibes? Is that kind of similar? That's it was the first thing that came to mind, and
That's
sometimes it does line
interesting.
up. That's why I
I haven't actually pulled that up in a while. So let's take a look. It's different. I mean, interestingly, right, we get a lot of this Leo, we've got Uranus and Pisces, the Mars in Gemini. Um, I'm actually, oh, and the North nodes in Sag. It's not like an eclipse period. Um, so there's a lot more planets here that are actually in places of decent dignity. I mean, you have the moon in its home sign. You've got a not Jupiter, Venus, sorry. You have a Mercury, Jupiter co-presence. The real thing that is failing in this, and sort of I think what we see as the failure of the Treaty of Versailles is the Saturn here, right? Saturn and structure. Saturn doesn't do well in Leo. It's far from home, right? Aquarius is the traditional one of his traditional signs. And so he's not seen as having great dignity in Leo or Cancer. He has more, I don't know that he's better or worse in either one of them, but I don't love seeing Saturn in Leo. Saturn isn't in exile, but Saturn is in detriment. Or Saturn isn't in fall, Saturn's in detriment, or what I sometimes call exile in Leo. Um, and so I think that's really maybe more of the failure of this chart is its sort of long-term ability to withstand change. Um, Particularly because you have this Saturn Uranus. It's a little loose, but it's still a degree-based opposition, which is also challenging Saturn. And particularly becomes into play because, right, World War II, Pluto goes into Leo, particularly towards the end of it, and starts, shaking up and redrawing borders. Yeah.
so would you say when you say detriment, right? Just think about that. Would you say
Hmm.
that's like the equivalent of like fighting with a broken arm versus like or like your arm tied behind your back type vibes?
Um, it's a good question. I think of the more of the metaphor of like what Saturn does well and like being in a situation where like he's not set up to be successful,
Mm.
right? So Saturn is an old man that wants it to be kind of cold. He wants it to be kind of dark. He wants to be able to like work on things that can like be preserved or sort of his big deal. And when Saturn is in Leo, he's in a hot place. It's really bright. It's a little bit more youthful, and he's having to present it constantly, which is not things that he's naturally good at doing. It's not that one is good or bad, but it's just like he's not in an environment that like speaks to his strong suits. And he comes across as more difficult. In the same way that like Mars is in detriment in Libra because you're bringing a soldier to a diplomat's dinner. He can do it, but he's kind of a troublemaker and he's not set up to be successful. Versus when Mars is in Aries, he's on his battlefield. He gets to do the things he likes to do. And it's like he's set up for success in a way. Um, and so I think for folks who are born with these placements, it's learning typically what I like to coach folks with is like, how do we learn to embrace the ways that you do things differently than a lot of our social norms around that planet and around that energy? And bringing that in will make those folks much more successful. It's a little different with world astrology and electional things because you're not
It's
like
not a
an
person.
individual. Yeah.
Yeah.
A nation, I might be like, hey, if I was an astrologer and saw that, I'd be like, we got to think about how you do this differently and create systems that are going to help you be effective that doesn't look like other nations. But yeah. Um,
If you were to say like as like a vibe looking at like these two charts, so they're not quite as close as they might feel. So there is potential for like a better outcome in per se, like because that was the vibe I was getting. I was more thinking like,
yeah.
you know,
I mean, Treaty of Versailles had an agreement and they came out of it with that in alignment. And it wasn't Some people won and some people really lost.
Yeah.
As whereas this chart, I mean, when I look particularly at this final 2032 chart, let me see if I can pull it up again. If we're just looking at this, right, this looks more like being stretched in different directions. We're seeing more crisis. We're seeing more action, but it doesn't have clear resolution. Um, and so I don't know that you're going to come out with something that's like like you're not having a like long-term structural failure like the Treaty of Versailles. You're having more of a like another crisis moment, another critical moment where things are being stretched to their limits. And the real question is which pieces survive and which pieces need to evolve and transform. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing is as Uranus has moved through Gemini and sort of the philosophy and the worldview of the nation has shifted. How is this then changing the leadership, right? How is this changing the world perspective? How is this shifting how its sense of identity and presenting and leading from that place? And it looks like one of the ways is that, like, no matter what answers come out of the Cancer Capricorn eclipses, no matter what answers kind of come out of the 2020s, there's still a major crisis that is going to unfold in the early 2030s. And it doesn't look like they actually get true answers. It looks like they're still being kind of caught in different directions around where the nation is going to go and what it's going to be. And so this might look both like crises externally, but I think what I'm also I think maybe hinting at is that there is a major sort of internal crisis around the identity of the state and is going to require I think is going to require either very great change to survive. Like, I don't think we're not going to see an Israel that looks like what it did in 2018, 2019 by the time we get out into the late 2030s from a like structural, political, and I think international perspective. Some of which I think really begins the last time we had eclipses in Libra and Aries, right? The October 7th, the horrific events in Gaza and just the decimation of that population. I do believe it's a genocide. Um, all of that is sort of creating, I think, some of this crisis and this disillusionment. And then there is, I think, ongoing tensions of, okay, who are we going to be? What are we going to become? And the answers to that are really putting a lot of what looks like stressors on the system and is going to things are going to crack open before they come back together. I haven't looked too much further than the Libra Aries eclipses, partially for my own sanity.
Hmm.
Um, I think that there's definitely more work to be done there. But I mean, I think if we're going to kind of give it a view, I'm sort of seeing like a couple of things, right? We're seeing the sort of what is the nation's idea of self and how others see the self, right? That's the Neptune opposition. We're seeing what is sort of mass support and alliances, as well as like when Pluto really kind of brings it up and challenges that, particularly from a more maybe youthful, younger generation, which I think we're already starting to see. And there's a lot of pressure around like Gen Z and like people need to stop trusting TikTok, seeing this violence and like all of these things. And so I think there's that layer of this that is kind of coming and pushing and pushing. We're also seeing, I think, as Saturn, the planet that rules the foundations, transit, into Aries and into Taurus. There is both foundational pressures from alliances, from others, as well as like financial is going to, I think, pick up when we get Saturn into Taurus. We're also, I think, seeing with the Uranus return, this real question overall of the overall ideology, right? Of the overall sense of self and worldview and how Israel plays or doesn't play into that. And, there's these ongoing tensions, I think, in all of these areas that are sort of coming through and sort of asking, what are we going to be? And sort of the crisis is sort of building and building through the 2020s. And I think is hitting some either powerful or difficult apex moments in the early 2030s. that puts the state in a place of crisis. And that could be crisis just internally, that could be a sort of larger conflict within the Middle East. Um, it creates a sort of foundational concern around how to move forward and what we will be. It's one of the reasons, like, when a lot of Zionists that I talk to will say, like, oh, Israel is like Jewish safety. And I look at the astrology and I'm like, I don't know how safe Israel is. I'm going to be completely blunt with you. It does not look like it's getting better for Israel from a safety and stability standpoint for a while. And it really depends on how Israel gets through Uranus return, right? That's 8 years. That Neptune opposition is fucking hard. That is a long transit. That's like, God, I should know this by now, but it's like, it's over a decade. And that Pluto opposition is like, that doesn't really end by sign until the early 2040s. This is not this is not a momentary crisis for the state. This is a long term crisis, and this is a long term structural one. And I think one of the things around that and the dangers that I see, right, Pluto and Aquarius more generally, as I've talked about, often talks about the rise and or fall of Jewish political rights, is that we are probably in a period where, like, I think Jewish safety overall is in a place of real tension and insecurity, both whether you're in the state of Israel or outside of it. And I don't mean that to fearmonger, but to say that, like, that's the transit as I am seeing it in the sense of like the highs and lows of how we've seen it historically. And so all of this kind of comes together to say, like, who Israel has as its leaders in the 2020s and early 2030s, I think is going to tell us a lot about how things move forward. I think watching the rhetoric and how things are changing in that rhetoric as Uranus goes through Gemini, particularly as it hits about 10, anywhere from about 8 to 15 degrees of Gemini, really maybe like 8 to 13, is going to tell us a lot about its sort of sense of self and how things are evolving. And also looking at like how mass political support is shifting and or being used in the state, right? Are we seeing a move towards like, are we leaning more into that, right? Are we listening to the people, or are we hardening and avoiding and pushing people away? Are we leaning into like right wing, like kind of Jewish theocratic state? Like those are the questions that I'm having that's going to really highlight how this is going to move forward and what we're going to see in the early 2030s. Um, and yeah, that's a really hard. I don't like saying that. I don't want to be the person that's telling folks like everything's like it looks like shit, but it does look really, really difficult. And I, as an American Jew, you know, I don't necessarily have a lot of strong feelings about that state, but I do know that like the unfortunate reality is that the politics of Israel impacts me because people expect me to have opinions on it and people expect me to like have feelings, and also that like I get told on all different sides, right, how I should be feeling about it and what I should be doing. And it's like whether or not I want to have a relationship with that state, the outer world politics impacts my ability to be safe and to live freely, just because I happen to be Jewish and the Israeli state happens to be a, at least in theory for now, a Jewish democracy.
Because of the essentially, if we, the colonial nature of the foundation of Israel, because we have to be, realistic about it. Again, like there's no sort of escaping that. It's like looking at outer planets have an effect on planets that feel more in the middle to me, like Jupiter, right? And then I'm almost looking at that last chart that you were showing, and it looked like there was like a T square, but it was between like Chiron and Lilith and like something else. And I was like, I'm not that good, but it does kind of look like that. And I'm looking at that as like, I don't know, are those like the younger generation? Like, do these planets kind of go generationally speaking? Because like, is that potentially reflective? And also, like, if we're looking at the time period we're looking at and the Uranus return is 8 years, then 2033, is there another eclipse or is there, another event coming in 2033 that you might see? Since that would be like the 8 or that 8 year.
So,
period.
I mean, yeah, by 2032, Uranus is solidly in Cancer, and so we're not having that. I mean, um, the generational stuff that's ongoing is the Neptune opposition and the Pluto opposition.
Mhm.
Um, there are definitely, I think, more eclipses that'll be happening 2032 to 2034, particularly in Aries and Libra. For the sake of time and to kind of keep us grounded, I was like, we're going to stop before we hit 2035. We're going to stop now because this was like, I already knew it was going to be a long one. And so I think that there's ongoing research that we can do. I just think that as it gets further and further out, prediction gets harder and harder because you have less real world data to work with. But
It's
the
like
early
trying to predict the
2030s
weather
do
in a
look
hundred
rough.
years. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not impossible with astrology. I just want to be clear, like my training and my expertise. I
Mhm.
am not, I would not say that I'm there yet with like long-term stuff. And that's okay. But I want to give you good information in the analysis of what I see now. And I
Mhm.
think that there are probably astrologers who look at this and see the data differently, or they're going to have slightly different interpretations of how things are going to come out. I might not be exactly right on the what, but I will tell you it looks really rough. Like this is rough, difficult astrology to work through. And that to me alone gives me pause. Um, if someone was talking to me about wanting to move to Israel, I would be more and more nervous as you get into the late 2020s and into the early 2030s. I would probably be advising people not to do that, particularly by 2032.
Yeah, if you're, looking at that, that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Like, again, like you're not saying like I know with definite fact that any of this will happen. What you're saying is, and again, going back to the weather metaphor, we can look at patterns, right? And we can predict that it might be sunny 100 years from now in June in Italy, right? Looking at the historical weather patterns, right? We're looking at the
Right.
historical astrological patterns. We can predict that there's probably going to be some tension. Probably, is an understatement, and it's going to happen in this way, and this is how it's playing out. And that is, you know, again, we're not, I don't think we're necessarily here trying to like hammer home or prove or disprove any particular anything at this point. I think this is like just like a lot of information like to people, right? So that they can understand kind of what you're looking at. And again, I personally don't feel that you've been proselytizing or anything like that in any one direction or another or anything like that. So if you're concerned about that, just as like a general audience type thing. As obviously my lighting has changed, as the sun has moved out of range
We
here.
work with what is. We work
Um,
with what is.
but yeah, that's exactly it though, isn't it? Is as time progresses, there's so many factors. Who's in office, right? Who gets elected changes the outcome potentially. Now, you think about any movie where somebody time travels and changes one small thing, right? Can that change potentially the outcome based on planetary position? Do we really know too much? Like, how effective is it? It's hard to say, right? It's hard to say. You have to get there first, right? You have to
Yeah.
be there on that day in June, 100 years from now. I am curious though, thinking about that 100-year mark because 2035 is that 100-year mark from 1935. So, that
Yeah.
yeah.
That'll be definitely something. Yeah. Yeah. So that's yeah, I mean, I'm afraid of going too far into it. I think more likely what I'll probably do personally is probably look at things like uh, do some more layering around additional timing techniques with astrology to be like, okay, these are the most important dates I see coming up in the 2020s and into the early 2030s, just to really like call my own, refine this down. I don't think we're going to do any more podcast episodes, particularly about the future. But if there's other historical, things you want us to look into and sort of explain more of, we could definitely do that. I think Saturn and Neptune and Russia is super fascinating. If you would like something like that, there's lots of things we could do. So feel free to drop a comment about that. Uh, yeah, it is a little bit of work. It's kind of boring on the surface to watch us do it. but I think it can be really helpful in sort of getting a sense of what we're going into. And unfortunately, we are continuing to live in interesting times. Uh, and that's just how it goes.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's one of those things that time is just going to do what it's going to do, right? But one of the benefits to looking at this particular example of a creation of like a state or, country or whatever you would define, right? Um, and looking in the creation of this is we have the benefit of knowing the birth chart, right? And so that makes it such a great example of something that's easy to follow over time. And so I think,
Yeah.
thinking about like the future, we had touched on some topics back there about, what planets might represent what in relation to that. I think that might be interesting if you're willing, but it does sound like a lot. So I know
Yeah.
it would
And
require
it's
a
probably
lot of,
dependent because, yeah, I was just gonna say it's, I think, dependent on, you know, what planets embody what's going to vary, I think, from place to place.
Mhm.
So, woo!
I know
Uh,
I got one to the face too, just not long before that.
um, we live with crazy sociopath, aka cats, and we love them.
We do.
But what I was saying is, yeah, planets and like what they embody and like potential characters in the sense of like, is the United States a character? Is like, is Russia a character? I
Not
need to
even
do
a
some more
character, but like
research
an
and learning on that.
archetype. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's definitely, I think, more work that could be done there. There's always more to learn as an astrologer, which is delightful and overwhelming sometimes. But I think next time we're going back to our getting personal with the planets, and we're going to do Mercury finally.
I do. I'm
And
very excited for Mercury, I will say. But this episode has been freaking I've been like, yes, all the foundation. I feel it. It's finally I understand. I felt like I was maybe not grasping, and then I was like, you started explaining this and I was like, wait a minute. It's all starting to come together. So I felt really good. I was like, yes, I remembered this.
Celine Dion says, it's all coming back. It's all coming back to me now. Um, So thanks again for watching. And as always, we will see you next time.